start. Maybe I should say a couple of words. So I welcome you here as a guest lecturer.
Thank
So
you.
for everyone who doesn't know it, John Spencer is sort of our colleague from the University of East Anglia in Norwich. And he's originally from, I think you were in Indiana for a long time. That's not too long.
I did my PhD at Indiana and was at Iowa.
At Iowa, yeah, both with I. And yeah, he's sort of a psychologist, and so therefore he brings us, new and different perspective. He's way more closer to real human data. That might make way more interesting, because that's sort of the problem with our modern models, right? They all get more and more distant from the direct data from psychophysics, because you cannot find these data of higher cognition. So if you're more interested in the low-level stuff, then I hope you enjoy this talk. So, yeah, great. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So I assume this is Thursday, so everyone's been at the summer school for several days. So I'm kind of assuming you have some basic knowledge of DFT, but probably haven't done too many psychology or behavior-based examples. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk about a new model called Wolves, dynamic field model, which stands for Word Object Learning via Visual Exploration in Space. So this was initially designed as a model of what's called cross-situational word learning, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And this was done in collaboration with Jaz Bahat, who was our postdoc at the time, and my collaborator, Professor Larissa Samuelson here at UEA. So what I want to do, I'll just initially start off by telling you what is cross-situational word learning. So we do a lot of work in the domain of early word learning with kids. How do they learn their first nouns, for example? And one of the insights that's occurred over the last decade or so is that kids might track what are called cross-situational statistics. And that's been instantiated into a cross-situational word learning paradigm shown here. So in the paradigm, you see two novel objects on the screen, and you hear two novel names like bosa and khaki. In isolation, you have no idea which of the items is a bosa and which of the items is a khaki. And then I can show you another display, and you hear regli, bosa. And if you can track the pairings of the objects and the names that go together, it should sort of jump out at you that bosa must be the green object, because that's the common object name pairing that you've seen across these two slides. And if I then show you an object like this and say, can you tell me its name? Or I could give you a name and say, is this a bosa? Hopefully you would say yes. So what we do in the cross-situational word learning paradigm is we give people lots and lots of name object pairings over many, many slides. And then we test their recognition in a simple task where we might present an item and ask for recall, or we might present two items side by side, like in the training display, and give them now one name, like bosa, and ask them to look at the bosa. So using these paradigms, somewhat surprisingly, 12 to 14-month-old children can learn up to 4 words under some conditions. And in the same type of paradigm, older kids and adults can learn up to 9 to 16 words, which is reasonably remarkable. The paradigm is also interesting because there are interesting individual differences. So often we find that some individuals are strong versus weak learners. So we want to understand why those individual differences. Other data show that moment by moment variation in looking matters, which is interesting from the perspective of kind of embodied cognition, and for those of us who study looking as a process. There's also evidence of multiple learning processes going on. So in addition to tracking cross-situational statistics, people also habituate. And so these two processes kind of simultaneously co-occur, which is interesting from a learning perspective. And then, as the first example illustrates, there are big changes over the timescale of development, which we want to understand as developmental researchers. So what I'm going to do today is tell you, kind of focus most of the talk on wolves. What is the model? Walk you through it. I'm going to do this first, tell you about some of the basic concepts. Then I'll show you kind of a simplified simulator to give you a sense for how the model works. And then I'll show you a little bit about the MATLAB code that we use to actually simulate the model, tell you a little bit about that, since it sounds like that would be somewhat novel in your exposure at the summer school. And then I'll show you how we simulate some data, talking about first the timescale of the task, so simulations that highlight the role of attention and learning processes. Then I'll switch to the timescale of development and tell you how we've captured development using wolves. And here, this is the wolves is really the first developmental account of cross-situational word learning in the literature. And then I'll tell you a little bit about some kind of current stuff we're doing to try to look more seriously at individual differences. If you're interested, I'll tell you up front, everything from the presentation is in this paper, which just came out in Psych Review or Psychological Review. And you can get a link to this paper from the DFT website. So I'll pull up the paper in a couple spots just to highlight some of the details of how we quantitatively fit data when we get to that point in the talk. I should also mention, if you have questions, feel free to just turn your microphone on, and I'm happy to answer questions on the fly or take interruptions or whatever. So if something isn't clear, we might as well clear it up right away. Okay, this is the kind of, when we present dynamic field architectures, people often get very overwhelmed. And so in the paper, reviewers asked us to try to synthesize wolves, which is a very complicated model, down into a kind of simpler picture. And so this is the picture we settled in on. So each of these boxes is either a single dynamic field or a collection of fields subserving a particular process like scene representation. So wolves is actually an amalgamation of two prior models, one called the word object learning model, which is in this light green box over here, that did things like formed word object mappings and linked them to objects in the world, or as represented in a scene representation, built a vocabulary over time, things like that. And then a second model, which is shown here in red, which is called the visual exploration in space model, which did a lot of things like spatial attention, looking back and forth between objects, working memory, detecting novelty, forming a scene representation. So the two models sort of met here in the middle. And what we did with wolves was we tried to bring together the WOL model and the VES model in order to understand how kind of looking and learning processes go together with word object mappings to learn a vocabulary on the fly in situations like the cross-situational word learning task. You can see the model has can deal with auditory input, which comes in directly into a word representation field as just simply labels, like BOSA would be label 1 and Regli would be label 2. So we're kind of stripping away a lot of the challenges of detecting the sequence of phonemes and things like that. And on the visual side, we can present visual objects out there in the world, and it will kind of covertly attend back and forth to the different objects and detect their features and localize them in space. So we kind of have a visual side, which is much simpler in the simulations I'll show you than probably some of the more complicated robotics instantiations you've seen this week. So auditory input comes in here, visual input comes in here. The model attends in space. It extracts features at each location, forms working memory for the objects at each spatial location, binds them together at the level of the scene. And then the features it extracts from this visual stream are fed into the word object mapping field, which basically associates auditory word forms with visual features. And then memory traces of the word object mapping layer, forms of vocabulary using memory traces, which you probably learned about during the week. And those memory traces build up over time, which then constitutes the kind of the child's known vocabulary. Okay, so that's just a schematic of what Wolves captures. You can see we also talk in the paper about mapping to the dorsal and ventral pathways in the brain, and some other links there to neuroscience. Okay, so this Wolves model is using the concepts of dynamic field theory, which you learned about all week. The core concept in DFT is the formation of peaks, which reflect localized decisions about the world. And then these decisions are remembered in memory traces, which you've also hopefully learned about this week. One of the first things I'm gonna have, let's see, I'm gonna try to, I've got all of you, there we go. I'm just gonna move this window on my screen over so that I can just get rid of it because no one's got their cameras on anyway. There we go. Now I can see my screen fully. So one of the first concepts that we had to deal with in the paper that was probably unfamiliar to readers, but maybe familiar to you guys, is the notion of binding visual features by virtue of a shared spatial position. So in the visual representation in this model, we're going to have two feature space fields. So feature is along the y-axis in both of these images, space is along the x-axis. So when the model attends to the right side of the visual field here, it might see a green color on the right side and a circular shape on the right side. By contrast, if it looks to the left, it would see an orange color and maybe a elongated shape. And so in the visual representation in this model, it's going to attend back and forth to the different items and extract the features at those shared locations. And because there's these ridges of shared spatial attention, essentially the model is binding together the green color and the circle shape in this example. Let's do that. Okay. Next, I'm going to just show you now more of the model. And this is a simplified representation of all the different fields that are in the architecture, but it's sort of sufficient to get a sense for how the model works. So let me orient you to what you're looking at here. So here's our visual display. The model is going to covertly attend to the left or the right. You'll see as it, let's say, attends to the right, peaks will build in the visual field for, again, the green color and the circle shape. You'll see peaks, I think, in a spatial attention field underneath this one. And then as it attends to the features, it's going to pass featural information horizontally for color along this stack of fields and horizontally for shape across this horizontal dimension. Activation is initially going to come into an attention field as it attends to both the feature and spatial position of the object. It will also detect all features in the visual workspace that are novel using what's called a contrast layer. Once it attends to an object, though, it'll consolidate it in working memory, which is this third field. Consolidation in working memory passes activation to the scene representation, and the model will then take the current features it's consolidated in working memory and the current spatial position it's attending to, and bind those together at the level of a scene representation. It'll also pass the features along to a word. This is the word feature association or mapping field. So you'll see as I run the display that it'll attend to the color. And if a word is presented at the same time that it's attending to particular features, it'll form an association between, let's say, Wrigley and the green circular object. So a lot of the action in this cross-situational word learning paradigm is about the statistics that get pulled out in the word feature fields. So let me go ahead and run this, and you'll kind of see the model in action. And I'm going to pause as I go through, and I can kind of narrate what's going on. All right. So first thing that happens, you could see the model attends, which is not actually shown. It's shown here. This is the looking time. You'll see two different colors here. So the blue color is looking to the attending or looking to the right side of the display. So peaks form in the visual fields for green and circle. You can see it's attending to green and circle features. It's got these peaks in the contrast layer saying they're currently novel, and it's just consolidated those peaks in working memory and starting to pass activation into the scene representation. And you can see it's already knows where it's attending, which is to the right side of the display. And at the same time, he's hearing a word, let's say Wrigley. And so this ridge here is the activation of the auditory word. And you can see it's starting to form an association or a mapping between green and circle and Wrigley. Okay. So it's still attending. Okay, now what just happened? So once the model consolidates the object in working memory, that releases fixation, and the model is, because it's already consolidated what is in that spatial position, and the model is free to attend somewhere else. The most likely place to attend is, of course, now the left, because that's got where the other input is. Okay, so here you can see the red curve indicates it's now attending left. You can see it's pulled up orange and the elongated shape. It's now attending to those features. It's detected them as novel. You can see it actually lost its representation of the green object. So green circle is also novel at this point in the model. And it's now starting to form a scene representation. And you can see no words are presented yet. Okay, now a word gets presented, and so it's going to associate whatever that word is with the orange elongated figure or features. So it's going to look at that for a little bit. You can see at some point Wrigley goes away, it stops attending there. Now it's going to attend to the green item. And another word comes up. Oh, actually, this is just repeating the same video. And I forgot to put my little happy circle on there. Sorry about that. Here, I'll play it again with happy circle. So that just tells you where the model's attending, when the words are presented. So this is just the model fully in action as it is hearing the two words bosa and kaki, and it's looking back and forth. So it's just going to autonomously do that over and over again as we repeat, as we cycle through the different trials. So what you can see in this model is we're going to have cycles of novelty detection. So it detects novelty, it attends to one of the novel items, it consolidates that item in working memory, and at the same time, it's going to form associations between the words it's hearing and the features it's seeing. Those will get stronger and evolve over the course of multiple trials in the memory traces. And the last element of the model that I haven't told you about is how words can influence looking. So there's a key connection in this model, which is the word feature fields project back onto the contrast layer. And so that's the mechanism by which if you hear a word, you might recall that that word is associated with, let's say, the kind of beige, vertically elongated shape. And that could then drive you to attend to or to attend to or search for those particular features out in the visual field, and thereby look to the object features that are associated with that word. Okay, so again, word feature fields project back onto the contrast layer and can therefore drive attention to those particular items. Similarly to how novelty drives attention to novel items. Okay, so let me actually, before I let me just tell you about this one slide, and then I'm going to jump to MATLAB. So this is just one example of some data that we simulated, just to give you a sense of the type of data that come from this paradigm. So this the green bars are data from Smith and Yu 2008 with 14-month-olds, where they familiarized them with 12, I believe it was, yeah, I think it was 12. Might have been 6 or 8 objects. I can't quite remember. I'll look at the paper in just a second. But so they're going to repeatedly see word object pairings over the course of, I think, 12 trials with maybe 6 objects or 4 objects, something like that. And then at test, we're going to present them with 2 novel objects, and they'll hear bosa, 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 and we're going to record their looking time to the target relative to the distractor on those test trials. And as you can see, 14-month-olds look longer, reliably longer to the target than the distractor on the test trials. Same thing in a replication study in 2011, and then the simulation data from wolves in the same paradigm with the same trial presentations and same number of trials, et cetera, shows the same behavior in terms of looking. Okay, let me exit this. I'm going to now switch over to MATLAB and kind of show you the full model in action. So the model for this project was coded up in Cosavina, which is, I believe you probably aren't using this week, but it's an object-oriented, essentially programming environment for running dynamic field simulations. It's very useful for kind of psychophysically fitting behavioral data. The model itself will be up on the DFT website shortly. We're just kind of fine tuning it, but just show you a little bit of the structure of the model, just so you have a sense. We've got kind of the core code for the model, which is this crosset run file, which basically is what I'm going to run to drive the model. And that basically says we want to initiate a simulator, and then we're going to run all these different experiments. So in the paper, as I'll tell you about, we simulated data from, I think, 12 different experiments. So each experiment has to be instantiated in its own experiments code, which basically specifies what's presented to the model on every trial, right? How many seconds does it get this display? When do the words turn on? When do the objects turn on? How many trials? And with many different experiments that we're simulating, we basically need to instantiate the experiment for each paper that we're simulating. Under the hood on wolves, in addition to specifying what experiment we're going to simulate, The model is actually specified in a simulator file, which basically specifies all the neural fields in the architecture, all the lateral connections, all the inputs we need, et cetera, et cetera. So this is basically the full architecture. It looks terrible and complicated, but in the end, it's not too bad. And I think the key thing that's really nice about using Cosavina is, everything is nicely partitioned. So you instantiate your experiment, you build a model, you build a graphical user interface for the model, and it's very kind of modular. So, if you need to make a new graphical user interface to make figures for a paper, that's easy to do. You just strip away elements from your GUI. You can move things around, etc. If you want to play around with tweaking your model architecture, that's also very easy to do. Sorry, one second. I thought I had fixed that. I need to do right. Sorry. When you use Cosavina, if you do try it out, there's tutorials and such on the DFT website. One of the things that you have to do is link in Cosavina, first of all, into MATLAB using a set path command, which is all described on the website. The other thing that is helpful is if you add your simulator to the path, which is what I forgot to do. And now this should run. And there we go. Okay. So here's the kind of full simulator. As you can see in the, this is more complicated than the model I just showed you in PowerPoint. That's because we pulled away some of the elements in the architecture that weren't critical for conveying the basic concepts in our paper. So we simplified this picture, getting rid of, for example, I think the scene working memory isn't shown. There's a memory traces of the scene representation that wasn't shown. A couple other memory traces for these fields in the front end, et cetera. So again, that was very easy to do in Cosavina because we could simply just rearrange which elements of the model we wanted to include in figures. But again, let me just kind of show you this model in action. And what I want to highlight as it's playing, just going to let it run for a bit. So this is in the full Smith and Yu experimental paradigm. And so what you're going to see over the course of the model running is the different trials in the experiment unfold through time. When the model goes from one trial to the next, you're going to see everything kind of reset. So it should be relatively clear, but I'll point it out. What I want you to notice over here on the far left, these are the memory traces of the word feature or word object associations. And so these are essentially the statistics that the model is learning as the trials unfold. And I want you to kind of watch as the structure emerges, and it's going to actually learn or figure out essentially which word goes with which object. It's going to do that simply by building robust memory traces here, which then essentially pre-shape these word feature fields so that once it has a really good representation of which word goes with which features, it can essentially recall those word feature associations, and they can prevent erroneous associations from forming late in learning. And they do that by when a word is presented, it pulls up its learned features. You can see it's starting to learn that word probably goes with these features. And that can actually have an impact on where the model looks, how long it attends to each object. And as I said, it can kind of block erroneous word feature associations from forming in this word feature mapping layer. Okay. Maybe I can just pause for a minute while you're watching this run and see if you guys have any particular questions. No particular questions? Okay, that's good. It must be crystal clear. I'm gonna just let it run a little bit longer. And in fact, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna pause this. Let's just, I think it's gonna be a little bit faster since time is tight to jump to the figures in the paper. And that way you can see, yeah, some key elements of the model. So I've already talked a little bit about how attention to, let's say, the blue item on the right leads to a blue feature ridge coming across. When it hears DAX, that leads to this vertical ridge. It forms an association or forms a peak in the word feature field, which then leaves a trace in the memory trace. And then here's the kind of influence back. So as it forms strong word feature associations, that can lead it to, when it hears DAX, recall the feature of that item, and then through its interaction with the contrast layer, attend to the blue item in the scene. So that's essentially how what we call top-down attention or top-down attention to word feature associations biases attention in this model, or biases looking in this model. Let's see, let me jump to some results. There we go. This is the figure I wanted to show. Okay, so this is again that simplified display of the model architecture at the top. In this example, this is showing actually the formation of an erroneous association early in learning. So it attends to the red item on the right, and it hears the word BOSA, which in this case is incorrect. And it actually forms an erroneous association, which is hard to see, but it's right here where my cursor is placed. A little easier to see here. This is the peak in the word feature field, and it leaves a little trace here on the left side of the memory trace field. Over the course of many learning trials, you can see actually the correct statistical structure should lead to a diagonal mapping of features to words. So we kind of set it up so it would be nice and easy to know if the model was learning the correct statistics. You can see by the end of trial 30, it does. So it knows that this feature goes with this word, and this feature goes with this word, and this feature goes with this word, etc. And so down here, what we're showing is now late in learning, the model hears BOSA, the red object is present, and it actually is attending to the red object, but it does not form a peak in the word feature field. And the reason is it's got a strong memory of that BOSA means this feature, and that ends up through the memory trace bringing up a peak in the word feature field at the correct mapping, and that effectively blocks a peak from forming between BOSA and the red feature late in learning. Okay, so that's kind of the mechanism for it's Wolves. Importantly, isn't just a simple statistical associator, right? It actually, as it learns, it becomes essentially a nonlinear statistical associator. it lets its own decisions start to structure the statistics it'll extract from the world. Okay, so as I said, these are data from Smith and Yu and Yu and Smith, showing that young infants will look to the target more than the distractor in their canonical cross-situational word learning studies. One of the interesting things from their studies with kids is that we see interesting differences between strong and weak learners. Some infants learn more than others. And if you go in and you look at the characteristics of their visual exploration, what you see is that strong learners have shorter or less mean looking per 4-second trial than weak learners. They have fewer fixations than weak learners, and they have longer fixation durations. Okay. What's nice is that Wolves actually captures those data quite well. And so one of the things we wanted to do with the model was to understand where these individual differences might be coming from. And through explorations with the model, we discovered that, as you might expect, the characteristics of how your visual exploratory system are tuned influences how you explore, which in this paradigm influences what you learn about the words. And so what you can see here is what we did in our task or in the model is we varied a spatial attention parameter, which varied essentially how much input spatial attention got from the visual layer, which essentially speeds up the visual exploration. Okay. And interestingly, when you look at when you sort the models based on their performance at test, what you see is that strong learners or strong learning models have fewer fixations than weak learning models, which is just like what we see in the human data. And what's nice about having a model, of course, is we can go in and isolate Y. And basically, as fixations go up in the model, association strengths go down. So these are association strengths of word object associations. And as fixations go up, incorrect associations go up. So you have more incorrect associations in your memory traces. Now, if you think about this, this makes a lot of sense. So if you're visually exploring back and forth between the objects, and you do that quickly, each time you explore an object, essentially you have a chance that one of the words will be heard during that moment of attention. And early in learning, the only thing that matters is that the feature ridge in the word feature field and the word ridge in the word feature field co-occur, and then you'll form an association. So if you're fixating back and forth more quickly, you're more likely to actually form an association between a word and both objects. And that, of course, means you have more erroneous associations with fast fixating models, essentially. And if you have more erroneous associations, the strength of the correct associations goes down, because that essentially messes you up over learning, and you have more that you have to correct for as you discover what the correct statistics are. All right. So what we our take home from this work is that we were able to use this kind of mechanistic idea of how cross-situational word learning is unfolding to give us insights into individual differences in strong versus weak learners. And those insights suggested individual differences in how individuals are shifting their spatial attention around are actually creating strong and weak learners, which we could then use the model to manipulate and explore directly. And so when we think about human behavioral data now, we're really starting to investigate this hypothesis that essentially individual differences in spatial attention are related to learning outcomes. So that's kind of one of the things we're trying to test in the lab right now. So the model gives us insight into the kind of basics of behavior, and it can inform us about the mechanisms that underlie that behavior. Okay, in the psych review paper, overall, we ended up simulating 5 cross-situational word learning studies with adults and 7 cross-situational word learning studies that were developmental in nature, so looking at infants, toddlers, and children. Overall, it was a pretty impressive model, I think. The model was able to capture data from 132 data points across these 12 experiments with a single parameter setting, and do that quite accurately. So across those 132 data values from the experiments, the root mean squared error value was 0.1, with a mean average percent error of 15%, which is quite good for a quantitative model, particularly given that the parameters were fixed across all experiments, with the exception of developmental changes, which I'll tell you about in a few minutes. Now, one of the big questions you always get in the literature is, okay, Wolf seems like it's doing a good job, but how does it compare to other models that might be out there in the literature? And so one of the things we did in the psych review paper was we compared wolves to 2 other competitor models. And first off, what you can see from this table is that wolves captures more data than the other 2 models. So the other 2 models captured 69 data values versus wolves captured a total of 132. So if you wanted to do head-to-head comparisons of different models, of course, you can only do it on the subset of data that they both capture. And when we did that, essentially you can see that the error, the overall error in the model for wolves versus the other models is lower, which is fabulous. That's what you're after with a model, is, accurate quantitative accounts of the data. But if you look at the bottom row, one of the things that people often do in the model comparison literature is they use a couple different scores. One, this is the Ake information criterion. And what this does is it penalizes models for having lots of parameters. Okay. And this could lead to a long discussion. But basically, the rationale for doing that kind of comes from a regression approach. So, if you have a regression equation and you're adding terms to that regression equation, the more terms you add, the more precise your quantification of the data, but you might actually be overfitting the data. So this AIC value is a way to try to put models on similar standing by penalizing models that have many parameters. Now, one of the things you can see here, so with AIC values, lower values are better. And so you can see actually this middle model, the Kishirgis model, has a lower AIC value. And so typically what you would conclude is that this Kishirgis model is the best model. Now, interestingly, though, when you look at the fits of wolves versus the Kishirgis model, there are some clear cases in the quantitative fits of the data where Kishirgis clearly gets it wrong, but that doesn't really show up so much in the AIC value. So one of the things we ended up doing in this paper was kind of raising questions about how models are compared in the literature, and the difficulty of comparing a model like Kishirgis, which is essentially like a regression model with a neural model like wolves, which has many, many parameters, but those parameters aren't all independent parameters. And yeah, so it was an interesting aspect of the paper that I think raises lots of interesting questions about how you fit human behavioral data, and different classes of models should have different expectations, I think.
John, I actually have a question to this.
Yeah.
If you would calculate the AIC for a field model, what are sort of all the parameters that sort of count for that? Is that each resting level of each field and each connection weight, or are there certain parameters that are sort of summed up together?
Yeah, so we ended up going into Wolves, which is a very large architecture, and we counted up every parameter that we varied in any way while we were exploring how well the model fit the data. So there were a number of parameters that, of course, we were held constant across all these fields. So those parameters would count for as one value. But as we were tuning the model to get it to capture data, we tried out a lot of different things. And so we penalized ourselves for all of that exploration. And it ended up being, I think, yeah, it was something on the order of like 90 parameters or something like that. Versus I think the Kishirgis model had maybe 5 or 6 parameters. And yeah, and it was really interesting because I didn't know if our conclusion would fly with the reviewers, because we're essentially saying, this AIC thing that everyone thinks is the most important thing for model comparison in the literature. We basically concluded in the ending of our paper, well, that's a good metric, but when you have models that are very different types, it's not such a great way to evaluate models. And the reviewers seemed okay with that, which was surprising. I'll tell you why I think they seemed okay with that. I'm going to show you a couple data fits. So basically, in all the figures I'm going to show you, you'll see figures like this, and wolves is in yellow, and the Kishirgis, this other model, is in green. And the data are typically in blue. And what you'll see in figure after figure is that Wolves is doing a really bang-on job of capturing the data in quantitative detail. And the Kishirgis model has cases where there's these clear violations, which in a quantitative sense, is a difference between 0.2 and 0.5, a huge difference. No, it's not a huge difference quantitatively, but in this particular case, it really matters that performance in this incorrect condition is a chance, and performance in the correct condition isn't. So there's these kind of case after case where the Kishirgis model just kind of got things wrong. Here you can see it's getting things pretty much right, but just quantitatively worse or poorer than the Wolves model. Again, kind of quantitatively right, but poorer than Wolves. There's some examples where it didn't simulate the data we were simulating. Here you can see the fit's just a little bit worse. There's another couple toward the end where you can see the Kishirgis model just kind of gets things wrong. Here's another example, right? You can see quantitative differences across these high, medium, moderate, and low conditions, and the Kishirgis model is flat, right? But if you do that comparison quantitatively, these errors aren't so big, so they don't end up having a monster effect on the AIC value. So I think reviewers, when they were looking at this paper, basically said the Kishirgis model is not a very good model of all these different experiments. And so when we then said, and so ignore this fact that it wins on the AIC value, I think they were kind of like, yeah, okay, we can see why you make that conclusion. But I think it's going to be an interesting discussion in the literature about how do you evaluate different models the same effect based on our paper, hopefully. Let me see, how am I doing on time? Pretty much out, right? I'm gonna jump to some conclusions. I was gonna show you, maybe I'll just quickly roll through the rest of my talk just so you have a sense of other findings of interest from this paper. Another interesting thing that people have done in the literature, this is a schematic of the trials in the cross-situational word learning task I've been talking about. And in an interesting paper in 2013, they basically used the same slides, but they reordered them so that this BOSA was present on all the first 5 trials. And then let's say the Regli was present on the next set of 5 trials. And then the khaki was present always in the next set of 5 trials. And what they found is poor learning. In the data, one of the interesting things is they found habituation. This is actually a simulation of wolves, which mimics some of the data in the literature. And what you can see is on the first 5 trials, equal looking between the BOSA and the other item on trial 1. And then on trial 2, the BOSA is there, but you've got another object who's also present, which is called the varying object. And what you can see is the model tends to look at the novel object and less at the BOSA. And then on trial 3, even less at the BOSA, even less, even less. And then we go to the next set of trials where maybe the khaki is the repeated item. And you can see again, it habituates to khaki, and then it habituates again to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And you get this sort of zigzag pattern. And so interestingly, in the paradigm, you see a form of habituation as at work visually. But that's actually countered by, as you learn what the words are, your attention gets pulled toward those words, which is kind of this effect of the blue line, that even though you're habituating to each individual item, overall you're learning more about words. And so that counteracts that habituation. So it's kind of an interesting discovery using wolves to explain that. So it suggests there's both novelty detection, but also top-down attention driven by growing associations in the paradigm. So in summary, we have 2 types of learning or habituating to visual features, but then also learning word object mappings, which actually pulls you back toward looking at those objects when the words are presented. And then the last thing I was going to show you is some data on development. And basically, we ended up capturing developmental changes in the model by changing the time scale of the memory traces. So kind of how fast the memory trace deteriorates. And so early in development, you can see tau decay is faster than later in development. So basically, associations decay less quickly over development was the hypothesis we were testing. And that did a really nice job of capturing a bunch of different effects. So in summary, by just changing that tau decay parameter, we were able to capture 60 data points from 12 months to 5 years with just changing that single parameter. And so the account is quite robust over development. Yeah, so in summary, Wolves is a nice account of this cross-situational word learning literature, captures a large range of data and beats several other competitor models, and sheds new insight into the mechanisms that underlie performance of the task. I highlighted some individual differences in spatial attention, some discoveries we made about habituation and balancing that with top-down attention to words, and then highlighted a little bit about the timescale of development, and changing tau decay was kind of the core action there.